Uh-huh. Okay. All right. So welcome, everybody. Thanks for coming, and thanks to Dr. Haufler for joining us. I'm Jonathan Rosenberg from the Social Sciences Department, and my job is to moderate. And the first thing I'll do is introduce Dr. Haufler and then turn it over to her. We're really fortunate to have Dr. Haufler with us. She's a noted expert on corporate social responsibility. And I have to say, being here in Chicago, when I think of corporate social responsibility, I think she knows what I'm going to say. I think immediately of Milton Friedman's infamous statement when he was asked about corporate social responsibility. His response was, the social responsibility of corporations is to make profits for their shareholders. Well, Dr. Haufler has helped us comprehend that transnational corporations are primary agents of economic globalization, and their production and investment and commercial and management decisions really are critical components in the governance of the global political economy and international relations more generally. Her work has spanned multiple areas that are impacted by economic globalization and corporate behavior and policies such as environmental responsibility, women's rights, human rights more generally, and violent conflict and the prospects for peace. She is an associate professor in the Department of Government and Politics at the University of Maryland, an affiliate of their Center for International Development and Conflict Management. She's taught and researched at several prestigious universities and research centers in the United States, in Europe, and China, and she's advised international organizations as well. And her PhD is from Cornell, but I have to give a shout out to an institution we had in common. We both got our bachelor's degrees from Penn State. So I'm very pleased to have Virginia Haufler with us today. And Professor Haufler, you're very excited to hear what you have to tell us.
Thank you so much for that lovely introduction. And I want to thank you for the invitation to do this. I really appreciate that and I'm flattered. Before I really start, I did want to warn everyone that I am just getting over a very bad head cold, so I may have to mute myself so I can go off and sneeze. And I hope that doesn't happen, but I wanted to give you a heads up in case I had to deal with my cold. So I'm going to share my screen because I did put together some PowerPoint slides, not too many, but a few. And let me just get that going. Where are my slides? There we go. So the topic I'm going to talk about today is global governance and corporate social responsibility. And although the introduction that I was given emphasized my interest in corporate social responsibility, a lot of what I'm really interested in is global governance and the way in which corporations participate in governing the world, maybe through corporate social responsibility, but often through much more complex incentive structures. So the central question I'm going to ask today is the one that animates a lot of my research. How do we govern global corporations in a world of sovereign states? So corporations are global, but our regulatory systems are primarily national. Those borders between countries, they represent different regulatory systems and a limited ability of governments to control or hold accountable corporations for what they do outside of those borders. Note also that international law applies to states. It does not apply directly to corporations. And yet, corporations are global. They are global in their organization. So a multinational corporation has operations in many countries at once. They are also global in their trade structures. Global supply chains, which are in the news a lot lately, those global supply chains connect companies across borders. So what I want to say today, or sort of argue loosely, is that in the past few decades, what we've seen is an era of innovation and experimentation in global governance. And that experimentation included the participation of corporations in standard setting, rulemaking, negotiations, monitoring, and enforcement. What I'm going to do is look at an area that I find particularly interesting and that I've been working on for a while, and that I thought you might be interested in too. And that is the area of how companies have been integrated into conflict prevention and peace building initiatives, many of which basically involve the creation of new types of global governance. So I'm going to start with the 1990s in Africa, a period of time when there are multiple civil wars that seem to last forever. And these are horrific wars in many cases: child soldiers in Sierra Leone, genocide in Rwanda, and continued unending, intractable seeming conflicts in Angola and elsewhere. This map covers all of the conflicts that occurred actually into the 1990s. The Second Congo War was in the 1990s. But all of these conflicts together over the course of 20 or so years are often referred to as the Great War of Africa or the World War in Africa. So there were numerous attempts by the international community to resolve these conflicts, and they failed. From diplomacy to UN sanctions, efforts to bring rebels and governments together at the negotiating table constantly failed. They fell apart. They did not succeed. And this is despite a lot of efforts to, for instance, investigate sanctions busting to make the sanctions work better, numerous accords and agreements that did not ultimately bring peace. So what we see next is that a lot of the activist organizations very concerned about conflict, human rights, humanitarian issues became frustrated essentially with the failures of traditional diplomacy and traditional international governance. And here I'm going to give some credit to two organizations: Global Witness and Partnership Africa Canada. So these are two NGOs, one mostly working in Angola at that time and one in Sierra Leone. And each of them, in casting around for what is causing these civil wars to continue unendingly, they reframed the whole debate. They both issued reports in the late 1990s identifying what they viewed as the significant barrier to peace. Their investigations revealed that natural resources, particularly rough diamonds, were financing rebel activity. Rebel leaders had no incentive to end the conflict and bloodshed because they had a ready source to hand of income to buy weapons and pay soldiers. So I'm going to focus particularly on rough diamonds, and that is what Global Witness and Partnership Africa Canada, in fact, eventually became well known for. They looked at the flow of diamonds from areas of conflict into Europe and elsewhere and put the responsibility on companies in the diamond industry, especially De Beers, the major company. That's where they put the responsibility. So if we're talking about corporate social responsibility, they were looking to companies to do something about the way in which the rough diamonds that they traded were causing so much suffering. And this is just a map that shows you some of the pathways by which rough diamonds went from Africa into Europe, where they were cut and refined. And they were coming from these areas that were conflict zones, particularly Sierra Leone, the Democratic Republic of Congo, and Angola. Now, De Beers, some of you may have heard of De Beers. De Beers was the major diamond producer. And in fact, it had been organizing the world's longest lived cartel, literally over a century old. But by the end of the 1990s, it was getting more difficult and costly for De Beers to maintain its control over diamond supply. So this is a supply-oriented cartel in which there were long-term contracts that De Beers signed with many diamond suppliers, controlling the amount of diamonds in circulation at any point in time. By restricting the amount of diamonds, they could prop up the value, the cost. In addition, De Beers had been very successful at convincing most people that diamonds are forever and diamonds are a sign of love. By the end of the 1990s, however, the breakdown of order in these African states disrupted that system and put a lot of diamonds, rough diamonds, out into the market, thus undermining the price. In addition, the USSR, another major source of diamonds, had collapsed and was no longer participating in the cartel. So this is still a highly concentrated industry. De Beers still has control of a lot of the supply, and other places have a chokehold on other parts of the market. For instance, the United States, New York in particular, that's where most diamonds go. 80% are marketed from New York. Now, what happens is that those two NGOs, Global Witness and Partnership Africa-Canada, identified rough diamonds as a cause of bloodshed. They reframed diamonds from being the symbol of love and trust to being a symbol of violence, of linking them to child soldiers, calling them conflict diamonds, or better yet, blood diamonds. They launched a campaign excuse me. They launched a campaign that was taken up by many other international organizations. They mobilized a transnational coalition targeting the diamond industry. They wanted to make the private sector do something about this link between trade in diamonds and rebel violence. I should pause here. Perhaps some of you may remember the movie Blood Diamond with Leonardo DiCaprio. That's what it's about. So the Blood Diamond campaign powerfully reshaped the conversation around civil war, international trade, and especially, of course, diamonds themselves. It led to a lot of research and academic study of the linkage between natural resources and civil war, debates over greed versus grievance as a cause of war, but increasingly this recognition of the political economy of civil war, that trade is in fact a really important element in understanding the dynamics of rebel violence. What is particularly important here is that this campaign, this Blood Diamond campaign, identified a problem, civil war and trade in diamonds, and a solution. And the solution put responsibility on corporations. Instead of looking to the UN to resolve conflict, they were looking at De Beers. Now, all of this is particularly interesting from the standpoint of global governance. The Blood Diamond campaign clearly had the potential to undermine an entire market, the market for diamonds. It was a point in time in which the industry, particularly De Beers, was open to innovation and to thinking differently about their role. De Beers, although very reluctant at first to do anything, eventually came around because they really did fear the impact of the Blood Diamond campaign on their market. I should note that many in the industry displayed increasing concern over this Blood Diamond campaign and what it might do to the market. So it led eventually to an unprecedented negotiation, something we had not seen ever before. So the diamond industry formed an entirely new organization, the World Diamond Council. This would represent the entire industry in negotiations to create some kind of governance system that would regulate the trade in conflict diamonds. or I should say the trade in diamonds, to exclude conflict diamonds. The negotiations were convened in Kimberley, South Africa, giving that name to what emerged as the Kimberley process. It brought together producing nations such as South Africa, but also consumer states such as the US, the two NGOs, Global Witness and Partnership Africa-Canada, and of course, the World Diamond Council. All three of these stakeholders participated in designing the Kimberley process scheme for certifying diamonds. It is a hybrid of public and private participation, what we now often refer to as a multi-stakeholder governance scheme. So not global governance in which governments are the main players, but one in which there are multiple stakeholders, an array of participants. They created a new kind of international organization to regulate corporations and trade among them. Oops, I didn't mean to do that. The Kimberley process has essentially two levels of regulation and standard setting and enforcement. It is made up of representatives of governments, companies, and NGOs or civil society. The industry, through the World Diamond Council, was given the responsibility of developing a system of warranties or certification and chain of custody that would track rough stones from the diamond fields to the border of the country. They would be certified as not coming from conflict zones. So part of what the Kimberley process does is it identifies the conflict zones. By the time Kimberley was put in place, or a few years afterwards, a lot of the conflicts did die down. And today, the only conflict zone really is the Central African Republic. Most of the other conflicts or conflict zones are now relatively peaceful. But it is the industry taking on this responsibility to develop a certification process within each country. Now, at the borders, the states take control. So all the member states in the Kimberley process commit to not export diamonds that are not certified and not to import them either. In other words, it's a whole system, regulatory system that involves import and export controls. They had to go to the World Trade Organization to get permission to do this because it is, as many people have pointed out, it is kind of reestablishing a new kind of cartel, this time, a cartel that defines legitimate diamonds and illegitimate or conflict diamonds. Note that conflict diamonds are defined as rough stones from rebel-held territory. This is central to the Kimberley process. I should also note that today, the Kimberley process incorporates almost the entire market. There are almost no countries or companies that are outside of the Kimberley process. It truly is comprehensive. This is an entirely new model of governance. And it was established in 2003 was when it came into force, and it is in force today also. It has faced a number of challenges, some of which it has not addressed successfully. The main one is this definition of conflict diamonds as only coming from rebel-held zones. The Zimbabwean government, for instance, took over Marenge diamond fields in a very bloody way. And many people would argue that those are blood diamonds. But under the definition of Kimberley, they are not. And this issue of is it just rebels that define a conflict diamond, or could it also be governments, is something that is still an ongoing problem and challenge. And in fact, such a challenge, along with the challenge of there are problems with, for instance, counterfeit certificates, and a lot of smuggling going on. So there's leakage in the process, even though it almost everyone is involved in it. There are still problems there. The original two NGOs left the Kimberley process back in 2010, 2011. Other NGOs have taken their place. There is still a civil society council within the Kimberley process. And the United States and some other Western governments regularly put on the agenda this definition of conflict diamonds. And it has been, as I said, a big challenge. So what do we learn about global governance from this story? Well, part of it is a story of disaggregation of responsibility. When we think of something like a governance system, we think of one actor, one organization taking on all the steps in the process of governance. Identifying a problem, setting the agenda, establishing the standards or rules of the institution, designing implementation measures or mechanisms, monitoring behavior and compliance and auditing, enforcing against those who violate it, and adjudicating differences. What we see in the Kimberley process, we actually go on to see in many other initiatives that now exist. So it is no longer, the Kimberley process, while unique in some ways, is no longer unique in that multi-stakeholder design in which different elements of the governance process are taken on by different actors. There's a variety of certification systems out there. You may know, for instance, fair trade certification or certification of coffee or palm oil. There's a whole array of products and industries now in which there are similar kinds of global governance, although none quite like the Kimberley process. A lot of this sort of goes to that question of the responsibility of corporations in global governance. We do not have the kind of international organizations or central government for the world that could regulate global companies. And instead, we've come up with these other systems in which companies themselves take a role. Now, there's more to the story of conflict stones, and the violence in Africa did not end with the Kimberley process, although the original countries of concern are now at peace. So there's been continued violence, for instance, in the Democratic Republic of Congo and the First and Second Congo Wars. Excuse me. In addition, there's been conflict in other areas of Africa. Most of this concern about conflict is on the African continent note. What we see happen after the Kimberley process is established is there's concern about other natural resources that finance war. And in fact, prior to the Blood Diamond campaign, there was an attempt that did not work to address coltan as a source of money for rebel violence. But eventually there was a sort of a settling on 4 key minerals as conflict minerals. So we're moving away from diamonds now, looking at a wider array. These are often referred to as the 4 TG: tantalum, tin, tungsten, and gold. These are in a lot of the things that we use, and there were a lot of campaigns to address conflict minerals. They tried to use that term blood, but it didn't really stick. We don't have sort of blood cell phones. That hasn't worked. But these campaigns were surprisingly successful given, or I should say, because they happened by, in the 2000s and into our current era. We see a lot more expectations of companies to get involved in peace building, and conflict prevention, higher expectations in terms of corporate social responsibility, and more participation or willingness to participate in a variety of governance schemes that establish standards to control the flow of conflict minerals. So this is just a nice display I found on the daily use of conflict minerals. We use them in all sorts of things every day. But they are, in fact, associated with bloodshed in various countries of the world in which they are mined. What happens with conflict minerals is this sort of expansion in the number and type of initiatives or governance schemes, a variety of sort of soft law by industry, various transparency and reporting requirements, like tell me what's going on, due diligence, which is all about know your business partners in the supply chain, certification, that's similar to Kimberly, and surprisingly, transnational regulation by states, in this case by the US. So when it comes to certification, we have another unique program. The 4TG minerals are, all of them, they tend to need to be processed in some fashion, processed in a smelter. And this was sort of a clever recognition on the part of people looking for a way to control conflict minerals, that if you get the smelters to certify that none of the stones, none of the minerals coming into their smelter are from conflict zones, that you have this choke point that helps you control that. And so there's now a conflict-free smelter program. It's a supply chain certification system. We also have the OECD due diligence guidance for responsible mineral supply chains. So this was a multi-stakeholder process of negotiation, trying to come up with standards for how companies make sure that there's no abuse within their supply chains. I should note that the European Union is about to implement an EU due diligence regulation. It's not just for conflict minerals, but for a wide variety of other things. Different industries have come up with conflict-free systems themselves. The World Gold Council has a conflict-free gold standard with a whole compliance process for figuring out whether your minerals are in any way associated with bloodshed. Probably one of the more interesting ones is the US Dodd-Frank regulation, which was all about reforming the financial system after the collapse of 2008, 2009. But there was a provision in there, a provision on conflict minerals, that all corporations that sell stocks on US stock markets had to report whether they had conflict minerals in their supply chain. And so it's a reporting requirement. So it's not like enforcing them in terms of don't use conflict minerals. It's just saying you have to know. There's been a lot of pushback. It's not as strong as it was originally written, but it is still in force. The European Union also has something similar. And then we have individual companies. So this is a report by Apple to the SEC under the Dodd-Frank regulations. And in fact, Apple was very quick because of its reputation. It was very quick to adopt a conflict-free set of policies. And there's widespread recognition that there are no conflict minerals in the Apple supply chain. So this is a company that really takes corporate social responsibility or reputation, which is what they're aiming at, very seriously. So to conclude, I don't want to take too much time here. If you have any questions, conflict minerals governance illustrates a lot of the characteristics of global governance today. So we have multiple overlapping initiatives at all levels, and I did not even go over all of them, believe me. There are numerous ones from the local level to the transnational level to the global level. by industry sectors and by larger multi-stakeholder processes. The initiatives incorporate different mechanisms with variation in how strong they are, how constraining they are on companies. There is explicit harmonization among many of them. In other governance initiatives, we may not see this kind of harmonization. But for conflict minerals, there is a lot of effort to make sure these overlapping initiatives actually match up and reinforce each other. And overall, we see this sort of movement towards regulating or establishing standards at different parts of the global value chain. This kind of global governance probably could not have taken place in an earlier era, because we are now in a period of time when corporate social responsibility is more and more an expectation of companies. And numerous people I've talked to in business, in polling, and all sorts of areas will say this, that companies are expected today to do something on corporate social responsibility. Higher expectations lead companies into participating in global governance. I think what's happening with companies withdrawing from Russia today is unprecedented, but it really is a sign of how important they see their sort of reputation and their position in society as depending in part on responding to social and political affairs. Domestically in the United States, there's a lot of concern maybe not concern is the right word, but a lot of contention over the role of companies on some of the social issues facing us today. And I think what's really interesting from my perspective is just the participation as governors by corporations in global governance, sort of institutionalizing CSR in collective initiatives instead of it being something that individual companies do. So with that, I would like to stop sharing and see if anyone has any questions or comments.
Great, thank you very much, Dr. Haufler. Any comments or any questions, please use the hand raise function, or if you can't participate live like that, use the chat function. So does anyone have any questions or comments for Dr. Haufler? Seeing none so far, I could certainly break the ice. I found the talk to be absolutely fascinating. Thank you. And really interesting illustration of a lot of things that I look at and teach about in talking about international environmental politics and in teaching global political economy as well. So boy, a lot of questions, but let me start with one, and that is, you really explained in a very convincing way a lot of the motivations of corporations to actually self-govern. One that I didn't hear, which is sort of, kind of the maybe a somewhat cynical take, but it's kind of regulatory policy 101 truism, that corporations will self-regulate and self-govern as a preemptive tactic to keep from being regulated by governments or intergovernmental organizations. In other words, to control the process themselves rather than have limits imposed on them. Do you see that in the cases that you study?
So in my broader research, that actually is something that I often argue, is that one of the incentives for companies to adopt sort of forward-thinking policies is in fact to prevent governments from thinking they should be regulating them. I think what's interesting about the conflict minerals and diamonds case, I'm not sure that was preemption, because I don't see that as an arena in which there was a lot of, at the time, there wasn't a lot of recognition that companies might be regulated as a way of creating sort of peace, conflict prevention. And the whole notion of companies having a role in conflict prevention was very new. And it is still something that is not widely recognized. So I think you're right. If I was looking at environmental issues, which I have done, I think that's exactly true. I'm trying to think of an example. It's not coming to me right now. I have an example. So at the International Studies Association conference, which I recently attended, I presented a paper that was on climate change in the insurance sector. The insurance sector is beginning to withdraw cover from coal projects of all sorts. And one of the incentives for them to do that is in part the kinds of actions and policies that governments are adopting. So governments are beginning to withdraw support from coal projects, from fossil fuel projects. And there is perhaps some concern on the part of insurers that the government will step in to sort of force them to either, to fall into line on their policies regarding climate change and climate mitigation. I don't know if that was a good example, but it was the one that came to my mind just now.
Yeah, it certainly makes sense. Yeah, anyone else? Questions or comments for Professor Haufler? Yeah, from Jeff Terry, our department chair. How does one resolve the conflicts with these major corporations? Let me find the rest of that. Major corporations who do both good and evil. You mentioned De Beers.
Corporations are complex organizations, and they have multiple, they're pursuing multiple things at once. And so there are many times in which they're doing good things over here and bad things over there. I'm not sure you reconcile it. This is why the question of how do we regulate companies in a global world, that question is so important. So a company can be doing, Nike can be doing great things at home, but its suppliers in Vietnam are suffering greatly in sweatshop conditions. How do you reconcile that? And I'm not sure reconciling the good and bad is possible unless you're going to go down a radical route and say that the problem is capitalism itself, right? So long as we're living in a market economy, a capitalist system, you're going to have corporations. How do you ensure that corporations do not undermine the public good and contribute not just profits to a few, but sort of prosperity to all?
Great. Jeff also added the comment, one could also make arguments for Google along those lines, I suppose.
Google's an interesting case, as you probably know. They started with the phrase "Don't be evil," and they no longer say that anymore. And I think initially, I mean, one thing I will say: a lot of corporate leaders do not see themselves as evil. They see themselves as contributing to society in a lot of beneficial ways. We disagree on whether they are, in fact, contributing to society. And the leaders at Google are probably still very much committed to the vision of Google as contributing to the public good in a lot of ways. And yet we know that Google is now this almost monopoly, or it is a monopoly on search engines, and it's becoming huge in other areas of social media also. And just its big size is giving it a lot of power and influence.
Yeah, great, thank you. Another question or comment? Anyone? Okay, I don't see any others so far. Am I missing anything? Okay, well, I'll step in again. I think I could. I think Dr. Haufler, I could have a dialogue on this for the rest of the day at least. But I'm really interested in the description of how the conflict Diamond's campaign worked and the moving parts that came together. And, for someone coming from the environmental politics perspective, I think of the problems with multilateral environmental agreements and why so many of them are at best suboptimal in how they work. And then the one that's always kind of the paragon of a successful agreement, the Montreal Protocols on ozone depleting chemicals. And one of the things that's in common there in terms of the successes of the Conflict Diamond campaign and Montreal Protocols is the concentration of ownership within the industry. How critical a function of that is in the success either of self-regulation or of external, intergovernmental or governmental regulation of an industry.
Well, I know in the Montreal Protocol for the ozone, the concentration of the industry, there were only like two major companies making the chlorofluorocarbons at issue there. That was critical. And when those two companies came on board and said, okay, we've come up with an alternative to CFCs, and so let's go forward with this agreement, then the agreement went forward. So concentration does play a big role. The Diamond case, again, a great example of that, a highly concentrated industry. And really, if you got De Beers on board, you would be able to construct or negotiate this institution. So I think concentration is really important. I think the reason the conflict minerals arena has so many overlapping governance initiatives is because none of those sectors are particularly concentrated. Gold somewhat, but it's this wide variation among the 4 TG minerals. So you don't get sort of a hierarchical and I won't say coercive, but a system that is more formal and in many cases more effective.
Mm-hmm. Good, thank you. There's a question just been posted from Kevin Simpt. Often right. CSR. Oh.
Yeah, I can see it.
Oh,
so
okay,
CSR sounds reactionary. We don't want to be regulated, or we're worried about customer backlash. But are there cases of CSR being embedded in a corporation's culture, even without obvious benefits to be had? Well, the debates over corporate social responsibility are really interesting because many of them will point out that corporate social responsibility is a long-term perspective. And if you are looking for long-term success, adopting the CSR type policies will benefit you in the long run. And I would say one company that comes to mind that takes that very seriously is Patagonia, the outdoor wear company. And they incorporate into everything they do all sorts of particularly environmental values. And they are very sincerely held. And they do it in a variety of ways, both how they make their clothing, for instance, and the fact that you can send it back to them for recycling, and just a variety of ways in which Patagonia is sort of a genuinely responsible company. So we do have some CSR that is not simply a reaction to either the threat of regulation or consumer social responsibility, in which consumers will only buy from good companies. I also would note that there is now a legal way for companies to adopt corporate social responsibility by organizing themselves as what's called a B corporation. The traditional way corporations operate is they're supposed to be all about profit. They're supposed to respond to shareholders. That's what Milton Friedman said, but it's also sort of a legal thing where, at least technically, if you're off spending money on corporate social responsibility instead of the central thing that your company does, shareholders could sue you, sue management for doing that. And they have at times. A B corporation doesn't have that risk because they say from the get-go, we're organizing as a company that will make profits, but will also give back to the community in different ways. And so there's now a number of companies. It initially was just very small companies, and now some relatively large ones are adopting the B Corporation organization. So there's a lot happening in the CSR space.
Great, thank you. Yeah, agreed. Anyone else? Okay, I don't see any hands raised.
Wait a minute.
Oh, I'm sorry, go ahead.
I think we missed one.
Oh, did we? Did we?
The outsourcing question.
Oh, yeah, sorry, definitely. Go ahead. Yeah, go ahead with that. That was a follow-up.
So the outsourcing, I mean, that's an interesting question. So with globalization, we did see the movement of a lot of manufacturing activity out of the developed countries and into many developing countries, contributing to the development of countries like China, Vietnam, Thailand, and elsewhere. There is this idea of a race to the bottom, that these companies are now setting up these global supply chains in which companies around the world in these developing countries are competing to be part of those global supply chains. And they're often competing, and their governments are competing by lowering environmental standards, by not enforcing any kind of worker standards, a variety of ways in which that kind of competition leads to downward pressure on regulations. Now, this, of course, is one reason why we have all these voluntary initiatives that I've been talking about, that these developing countries often do not have the incentive or the capabilities of regulating companies at a higher level, because they get too many benefits from attracting sort of low-wage labor. But I would note a couple things. Part of what drives that competition is the desire to attract investment. Most investment doesn't go to low-wage countries or low environmental standard countries. Most world investment goes to places like Germany or the United States, big markets with high wages and high standards. So, you know, you have to think about what kinds of industries are going abroad, what kinds of jobs are going abroad. And from this perspective of the United States, it's the low wage labor. I think I read recently, however, that in the garment industry, which is where a lot of us sort of what we think of when we think of outsourcing oftentimes is where our jeans or our sneakers made. In the garment industry, the contribution of wages, for instance, to the final product is tiny. Like, you know, there is no, in my view, there is no excuse for not paying more and providing better conditions of work, because it is actually a very small part of the final price. I don't know if I answered that quite, but I sort of rambled around a little bit, but let me clarify if you have any further questions.
If I could actually just add something to that briefly, because it's a really important question. I think you got to the heart of it. There's also potentially a very important difference regarding governance as to whether we're talking about a true multinational corporation whose foreign operations they actually own and manage, in which case they may be subject to governance by their home country and its laws and standards, and outsourcing in the more formal sense of the word, which means an arm's length contract between a company and an independently owned company in another country that is doing the work for it, which will be more subject to the governance of its own government, such as, you know, the infamous contractors that did the work for H&M and others in Bangladesh, and the disaster in 2013 of the collapse of the building where the work was being done.
So I recommend, if you're interested in these kind of issues in the garment industry, I highly recommend the documentary called True Cost, which goes through a lot of this. And it's an excellent overview of some of the dynamics, and features both people working in those sweatshops and also people trying to sell non-sweatshop clothing in an era of fast fashion.
Great. Anything else? Okay, for Hal just posted a question. Can you see that?
Oh, I see. Wait a minute.
Yeah.
Yeah. Consumer awareness. Well, how do you get consumers to recognize sort of the good companies versus the bad companies, or the good products versus the bad ones is one way of thinking about it. That's what a lot of these certification systems are about. So if you buy coffee that's certified as sort of by the Rainforest Alliance, it means it's sustainably grown. If you get coffee that's certified by the Fair Trade Association, it's coffee that gives more back to the farmers. There's a variety of information now that is available on certain products. If you go to Whole Foods, you can see this. They have lots of different certifications now. Some of the most well-known certification systems are, for instance, the Forest Stewardship Council, which is a fascinating global governance institution on its own. But that is for sustainable logging, or sustainable forestry, I should say. The Marine Stewardship Council, it's about sustainable fishing. Now, the problem here is that, number one, a lot of people don't know about these certifications, or they don't know what they mean, really, or which ones to trust and which ones not to trust. And now there's multiple certifications. So, as I said, the coffee could be Fair Trade and Rainforest Alliance. And, what does that mean? So there are attempts to generate more information so that consumers can be informed consumers. And there's a variety, but a lot of it actually ends up being on the shoulders of the consumer to find out. If you're interested in what products not to buy, there's actually a whole website, I forget what it's called now, that lists all the products that are being boycotted for different reasons. And they actually have lists of, these products and these companies buy from, and these are like a little sketchy, and these are really just don't do it. So there are these attempts, but I don't know how much they're getting through.
Okay. We're just about out of time, according to my clock. We have about a minute left. Any final questions or comments? Any closing remarks from Dr. Haufler?
I just want to say that I always enjoy talking about global governance and corporate social responsibility. Today, I emphasize more of the global governance than the CSR, but both of them are fascinating to me, developments in the global political economy that I think are unique to our era. The question I have right now is looking at the Russia-Ukraine conflict and the potential dramatic changes in the global political economy to come, whether the sort of relatively positive track towards corporate social responsibility and global governance will continue, or whether it will be overthrown. And that's about it.
Well, thank you. Great. A great way to tie a bow around all of this for now. Thank you very much. Thank you to Professor Hao Huang for organizing, to the Social Sciences Department for sponsoring the event, and especially, and everyone join me with an applause or a supportive message in the chat. Thank you very much, Dr. Haufler, for taking the time. This was fascinating and very engaging.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Okay, thanks a lot, and hopefully we'll stay in touch and keep talking about these things. Great.
Fellow Penn Stater.
Yes, indeed.
All right, I will leave now.
All right, thank you very much.
Thank you.